Sanctions alone cannot stop the Kremlin's aggression against Ukraine, but 4 years of consistent efforts have significantly affected Russia's economic situation. This was stated by the European Union's Sanctions Commissioner David O'Sullivan. The country is sliding into recession. They are facing serious problems with public finances, inflation, and very high interest rates. According to the commissioner, state banks have faced a rise in non-performing loans that the industry took out to finance the military economy, and now enterprises are unable to service them.
Russia is on the brink of a financial collapse similar to the crisis of 1998. Of course, a dictator fully determined to continue the war at any cost may well do just that. But sooner or later, the situation will become unbearable. David O'Sullivan, EU Commissioner for Sanctions.
In order to conceal the true scale of the problems, the Russian Federation is underreporting its war expenditures against Ukraine, according to the German Federal Intelligence Service. Russia's actual budget deficit last year was more than $30.5 billion higher than the officially stated figure. Due to a severe deficit, the Russian Federation was forced to cut healthcare spending in nearly a quarter of regional budgets in 2026. This is a record figure for the years of the full-scale war against Ukraine. For example, in 2025, only 5 regions had planned similar cuts. In total, officials will save about 107 billion rubles in the medical sector. This is roughly the same amount that Russia planned to spend on the development and production of drones over 3 years. Doctors say that even in regions without noticeable cuts to healthcare spending, there is a shortage of budget funds.
In the rural areas, of course, everything is struggling. There haven't been any renovations for a long time, and the equipment is old. A separate facility, like the psychoneurological dispensary, is in such a deplorable state that it frightens both students and patients. The clinic buys reagents and everything necessary for tests in large batches, but there are so many patients that the materials are simply not enough. Maria, a general practitioner at one of the Voronezh clinics.
One of the reasons for the large state budget deficit is the sharp decline in the Russian Federation's revenues from energy exports. Moscow is forced to sell oil, its main export commodity, on world markets at a significant discount due to Western sanctions and pressure from the U.S. on major buyers. Despite the fact that after the start of the U.S.-Israeli operation in Iran, oil prices rose, which helps Russia improve its position. This is not enough to stabilize the situation, analysts note.
There are already official statistics showing that revenues from Russia's main oil and gas sector fell by 50% last year. In other words, this is something that can no longer even be concealed. Even what can no longer be concealed already. Some voices among Russian officials or even economists who live in Russia and have always held pro-government, pro-Kremlin positions, even they can no longer turn a blind eye to all this because they see that Russia, the Russian economy, is now running at full speed toward the abyss.
Russian oil is not being purchased due to fears of possible reputational damage. For example, the largest state-owned bank in India refused to process payments for Russian raw materials, despite the easing of conditions by U.S. President Donald Trump, because it is unclear how long the temporary permit for imports will last. The bank is also concerned that this could expose it to risks on global markets. The Trump administration granted India a temporary permit to purchase Russian oil due to the crisis caused by the halt in exports from
The nations situated along the Persian Gulf include a diverse group of countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain and Oman, along with Iraq and Iran, all of which share this strategically important and historically significant body of water that connects the Middle East to the rest of the global maritime trade routes. Not Western analysts, I emphasize, but a representative of the Russian Ministry of Finance. What is the reason? I understand that the decline in oil and gas revenues is the main issue, but still, it's not just that.
Well, it's not only oil and gas revenues. Let's clarify about torn to shreds. That was said by Alexander Kalyander. Not in Russia, he worked at EQ.
Western, but Russian, right?
Russian, but Western. But nevertheless, the situation really is getting worse year after year. And if we talk about oil and gas revenues, that's not the only and not even the main component of the problems facing the Russian budget. I'll give you an example. Look, in the first 2 months of this year, the deficit amounted to 3.4, almost 3.5 trillion rubles, 3.45. Oil and gas revenues are needed to make up for the shortfall. In the first 2 months, the Ministry of Finance sold gold and yuan from the National Wealth Fund for as much as 400 billion. So where did they get the other 3 trillion from? Well, fine, they issued bonds for just under a trillion. This is official information from the Ministry of Finance's website for those same 2 months. There you have it. Their external debt also increased by about 300 billion, more than 1.5 trillion. This, you see, is the amazing superpower of the Minister of Finance of the Russian Federation, Anton Germanovich Silvanov, to spend money he doesn't have. There are simply no official sources showing where they got the money and spent it. It's completely unclear. Nowhere is this explained in any way. So yes, oil and gas are certainly important factors, but the current situation in the oil market connected to the war in the Persian Gulf due to a number of circumstances will allow the Russian Ministry of Finance to do what it has long dreamed of, devalue the ruble. And this will happen as early as April. The process will begin. Instead of selling foreign currency, which had worked to strengthen the ruble, in April there will be purchases, massive ones, into the National Wealth Fund. So asking what will happen when the National Wealth Fund runs out is absolutely pointless. Look, at the beginning of the year, the liquid part of this fund, the part that can actually be spent, not what has already been spent in the form of so-called investments in long-term projects of Rosneft or Russian railways, but what can actually be spent, that was 4 trillion. The budget deficit for 2 months was 3,450 billion rubles. You could say that if this were a significant source for covering the deficit, there would already be only the last remnants left in the National Wealth Fund, scraps. For March, maybe it would have been enough, but only with a big stretch, and even then, probably not. So that's why the printing press is running at full speed, and Russians are already fully feeling its effects, both in the form of high interest rates, which are an attempt to compensate for the operation of this printing press, and in the form of goods becoming unavailable, and so on and so forth. And now there will also be a devaluation, which will drive up inflation, because imported goods will become more expensive and even less accessible. In other words, it's guns instead of butter. This principle is already in full effect in the Russian Federation, and not just for the first year. Even pro-government economists from the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis, the Institute for National Economic Forecasting, and the Academy of Sciences are noting this. They all, in general, are saying pretty much the same thing. And they write about the same thing, that the Russian economy is slipping into stagflation, except for the military-industrial complex, which produces good statistics but does nothing to improve the standard of living in the Russian Federation. Well, except for a small segment of the population, so overall the crisis is already in full swing. Yes, and indeed the banking system is also far from being in good shape. The central bank has just published the latest statistics. It's not just companies anymore. Even Russians themselves have hopeless debts. These have grown to a record 2,400 billion, increasing by a third over the past year. And the share of bad debts on consumer loans has exceeded 13%. These are figures where if it's over 10, it's already considered a banking system crisis. At the very least, this isn't just my opinion. These are the assessments of the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis.
Maxim, but maybe Chinese business will save the Russian economy. It's reported that since the start of the war, the number of companies with Chinese founders in Russia has increased tenfold. The share of companies owned by Chinese nationals has risen from 3% to more than 22% of all organizations with foreign participation in the Russian market. Could this, in some way, keep the economy afloat, help the Russian economy in some way?
Well, thanks to the import of Chinese goods, yes. And in fact, this process essentially puts an end to all plans for import substitution. Either the Chinese set up companies here that, at best, simply rebrand or repackage products made in China and sell them on the Russian market, or Russia engages in import substitution. Both cannot survive at the same time. Nevertheless, even this significant share of Chinese The share of Chinese companies that have entered the Russian market does not compensate for the departure of Western companies from that same market. In other words, this exchange is not equivalent. Furthermore, as ordinary Russian citizens continue to lose their overall purchasing power, primarily because their personal wallets are getting thinner by the day, the broader Russian consumer market is becoming significantly less and less attractive for major trading partners like China to invest in. A very telling example here is the situation on the Russian automobile market, which already began to collapse last year, and this process will continue this year. Accordingly, sales, including those of Chinese cars, have plummeted, especially since the Russian authorities have started to shield themselves, including from China, with all sorts of import duties and recycling fees, trying to prop up their own businesses, which also bends. Accordingly, betting that the Chinese will come and fix everything in the Russian Federation is completely pointless, because there is no demand, there are no Chinese investments. It doesn't work any other way. Maxim.
I would be very interested to hear your personal opinion about the recent widespread collapse of the restaurant industry in Moscow, as well as various different types of other small businesses. Because white internet, according to internet whitelists, testing the internet and only on approved sites. That is, you can't book tables, order things online, or do certain things. And because of this, there's a collapse happening in Moscow, I want to emphasize. In St. Petersburg, the so-called white internet, approved by the government, has been used for such things for a long time already. Where could all this lead? How serious could this all be? Okay? And what risks does it pose for the Russian economy as well? Unfortunately, Maxim, we only have 1 minute of airtime left.
Well, this is called technological degradation, which the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiulina, warned about back in the spring of 2022. Well, now this technological degradation has caught up with Russia, and this could lead to the return of analog phones with those kinds of people will be dialing number by number, calling to reserve a table at a restaurant, of which there might be only two, for example, in a large.
The entire city is bustling with life and energy.